Welcome to St. Sarah's Parish. We're a parish of the Apostolic Johannite Church in Boston. And this is the third part of our series, The Mystics of the Commonwealth. We've been discussing a number of different things. We started in the 17th century with the Puritans and some other groups who came to New England. And we went on to look at the separation between the liberals and the Congregationalists, the Unitarian Universalists, later became known as Unitarian Universalists much later, and some of the spiritual ideas that came out of that period, including Quakerism and other spiritually minded or mystical type leaders here in New England, among whom were Anne Hutchinson, Mary Dyer, Marmaduke Stevenson, but there were many. The second in the series was with Reverend James Ford, who is the senior minister at the First Unitarian Church in Providence, Rhode Island. And he gave a wonderful presentation last time. Some of you were here about the Transcendentalist movement, which came out of the Unitarian Church, and some of the literature and ideas of the wisdom path to spirituality, which is very, very similar to the Gnostic approach. So we had a nice overview of starting in the 17th century, so the mid-1600s, and moving all the way basically through the 19th century and to the modern day. Reverend Ford gave a great overview of the kind of people that the Transcendentalists were. They were very much social activists. They were involved in the abolition of slavery. They were always in the introduction of kindergartens, for example, in the United States. Very, very influential people, writers like Henry David Thoreau. There are so many, Emerson, Margaret Fuller, and so it was a great overview of the kind of homespun spirituality in the 19th century when they were getting all these translations of different Hindu and Buddhist texts for the first time in English. So there was a question about whether or not the mystical side of Transcendentalism wasn't really homegrown, maybe it grew out of some learning about Eastern religions, but that's still unclear. However, I think that the preponderance of the evidence very much goes in favor of saying that New Englanders had a very, very mystical background, even though the Puritans seemed so anti-mysticism. And we have proof of that through people like Anne Hutchinson, who were not only religious reformers, but social reformers. This is the 1600s. Anne Hutchinson, there's a statue of her at the State House, and she was accused by the Puritan fathers of Boston of antinomianism, which means that she says that every person has a direct relationship with the divine. Well, that's exactly what Gnostics say too. So she was a Gnostic with a small g. Anne Hutchinson said, and I want to read you a quote, because we're this third installment of the series I entitled "From Tolerance to Love," and the reason that I did that is because you can see the progression from a kind of very intolerant place to tolerance, and then people who are really working hard to be inclusive and looking to deal with people in the right way. Anne Hutchinson was born in 1591 and she died in 1643. And she said, "The power of the Holy Spirit dwelleth perfectly in every believer, and the inward revelations of her own spirit, and the conscious judgment of her own mind, are of authority paramount to any word of God. It's amazing that a woman in 1630, 1640, about there, was writing like that. And she wasn't the only one. There were several women, at least 2 or 3 others, who were very active. And they were having meetings just like this, with a few people in their house, and they were getting in trouble because they said that what you experienced in your spirituality was yours and yours alone. And when she says paramount to any word of God, what does she mean? She means whatever kind of text you want to throw at me isn't more important than the dignity of the human person. It's absolutely revolutionary for the time. Absolutely revolutionary. And her disciple, if you will, Mary Dyer, became a Quaker. And the Quakers, some Quakers are very mystical. They have a very interesting mystical part of their religion. And this book, in fact, that we based this whole series on, which was by Rufus Jones, who was a professor at, he was a minister, he was actually a Quaker himself, at Haverford College in Pennsylvania. And he gave this lecture, Mysticism and Democracy in the English Commonwealth, which was part of the William Noble Lectures at Harvard University in 1930 and 1931. It was over the academic year. Excellent book. There are reprints of it available online. I highly recommend reading it if you're interested in the early period of you could say the early mystics of this area, remembering, of course, that they came from England. But what do they do with this? What this idea that Anne Hutchinson has so boldly put out there obviously gets a lot of people in trouble, including herself. So she had to leave the Commonwealth, actually. She had to leave English territory and go to, not because the English government was after her so much as the Boston group of people who were running things. She went to, let's see here, to New York, outside of what is now New York City. And it's very unfortunate because she and her 5 children, she kept in constant correspondence with people who stayed in New England, who were brave enough to stay here, including Mary Dyer and Marmaduke Stevenson, who are 2 of the Boston martyrs, what the Quakers called the Boston martyrs, who were hanged on Boston Common. Not because of their religious views, but because they were banished from the colony and told not to come back. And they did come back anyway, and so they broke the law. They were hanged for it. The British government, the English government at the time, said specifically that they could not harm anyone because of their religious beliefs. But that was kind of a technicality because they went against the law and came back. So, but Anne Hutchinson never suffered that fate. She suffered probably a worse fate, which was she and her children and her husband were really savagely attacked by some local Indians, and they were all killed, including her babies and little kids. So it wasn't a very happy ending for her, which is why she died so relatively young. I mean, she was only 50-something. So, but she's a big inspiration for a whole generation of people here in New England who were later interested in that kind of direct religious experience, and who were really not interested in religion by edict. or even by Scripture. So I think that these ideas were well known, and it's definitely part of what led to Harvard University, Harvard College, and you could say that the religious mainstream of Boston changed. And it changed very drastically in a very short period of time. From, say, the end of the 1690s into the, all the way to the mid-18th century, you see the development of what is now the Unitarian Universalist Church. And this is interesting for us because the Unitarian Universalists, and they are two different things. The Universalists were much more country New England. Until very late, they were much more Christian-oriented than the Unitarians tend to be much more broadly based pretty early on. But the Universalists also had a very spiritualist side, which was, there were people even in New England who were speaking in tongues. We talked about this the last time. They were having these really incredible experiences out in the woods and stuff. That part of Tufts University, for example, was primarily a Universalist organization. But they usually got along with the Unitarians, and for over 150 years, I think they've been cooperating, we would say, until finally in the 50s they put everyone in one convention. So that's why they're called Unitarian Universalists. But yeah, so this is part of the development of a kind of wisdom way of knowing that's very similar to the Gnostic way. Of course, the path for our tradition is absolutely, it couldn't be more different. It comes out of Palestine, it goes into Asia Minor, into small communities in the 2nd century. By the 4th century, it starts to divide. It's a larger group from the smaller group of the Johannine group, the followers of St. John the Apostle, beloved, who move away from what you could say the proto-Orthodox, so mainstream, what is now mainstream Christianity, and its ideas about original sin and a whole bunch of other things which we do not believe in. That you started seeing a big distinction in the 2nd and 3rd century. By the 4th century, they already separated. But this is all taking place within kind of a Catholic, with a small c, but a Catholic world, a very heavily Greek world, which is why you hear so much Greek in our liturgy. The ecclesia of all humanity. The ecclesia is the church. But it has a certain important meaning. Words are very important, so we keep some of those Greek words because they describe a very specific thing that in English, in colloquial English, it doesn't really translate into church. It's different. It's a gathering of souls, living and dead. So it's a very important distinction, and it's a very important agency for what we're doing here as a community. So moving through that, the history. This is Johannite history in 5 seconds. There was a big influence from this Johannine group on what were later called the Bogomils. The Bogomils were a very radical Gnostic group which grew up mostly around Constantinople, what is now Istanbul. And it moved west. In the Middle Ages. So by the 14th century, or actually no, earlier than that, by the 13th century, you start seeing what they call the Albigensians, or the Cathars. The Cathars are nothing more than Western Boers, which are nothing more than a group of Johannites that came from the original 4th century Asia Minor group. So it makes it all the way to France. And I don't know, maybe you know, maybe you don't know, they had a very bad ending. The Roman Catholic Church tried to persuade them over a long period of time to conform to their rules. And when they said no, and they were very powerful, because this was concentrated around the Rhine, not just France. Yes, they are from France. The Cathars are traditionally thought of as being from the south of France, which is true. But they were also in Italy and up and down the Rhine. So in some ways, you could say that the impulse of Protestantism is very much still felt from those days, from the Cathar days. Because the Cathars, they had sacraments just like we do, but they were focused on a very simple kind of religion. Obviously not involved with the state like it was in the Roman Catholic Church. The people who reached a certain level were called perfecti, not because they were perfect, but they had reached a certain level of attainment. And when they had the consolamentum, which is one of their important entry, when you enter the church and become a full member, they would hold only a copy of the Gospel of John over their head. So the Johannine/Johannite tradition, you can see very plainly there. So, a very long story short, unfortunately they were massacred. It was the first crusade ever launched against other Christians. And they were massacred. But they weren't eradicated. There were a lot of communities that went underground. And through a Byzantine, with a small b, history of little bishops and intrigues and infighting and backroom masses and just a ridiculously complicated history after that. It re-emerges as the Johannite Church in 1804. No, that's not. That's a different part of the legend. The other part of our tradition comes actually directly out of Freemasonry. It comes from the tradition of the two Saints John, which is contained within Freemasonry. And in France, the person who was the Grand Master of the Masons, the Freemasons in France, was traditionally held to be the Johannite pontiff. So the lineage that goes all the way back through the Templars, that's Templarism or Neo-Templarism, is something that came out of Freemasonry, which was brought together again with, you could say, the Christian side in 1804. So all the things came back together again, and even more so later. But so this is a very broad overview, and I don't want anyone to take my word for it. You can look it up, but it's a lot of. There is a huge amount of information that I'm skipping, obviously. I'm just trying to give you a basic overview of how different this is from, you couldn't possibly find a more different tradition from Unitarian Universalists in New England or Transcendentalists in New England than you do from, sort of underground French Gnostic movement that's been around Europe in somebody's closet for the last 1500 years or something. it's a very different experience, and one of the reasons that the Johannite Church is so outwardly Catholic is because it grew up in France, and in 1804, and later, you say later organizations of the same church using through the same bishops. It was very important to people to have the sacraments and to have them and to be assured that they were receiving the sacraments from people who were properly ordained under the Apostolic succession, which is what we do. So, the Apostolic succession, not only of our own Johannite tradition, which the Roman Catholics don't have, but from the French side, we have the regular Apostolic succession, you could say, through what they call the constitutional bishops in France after the Revolution. There are two founding bishops in 1804 who were originally Roman Catholic. So that's a basic overview of how incredibly different these two traditions are. But I mean, what Anne Hutchinson said even in the 17th century is almost identical to the kind of ideas that we have ourselves. That there is no scripture that is going to tell you what to do. In fact, sometimes reading scriptures, especially Gnostic ones, because they're very confusing, and they're riddled with all kinds of arcane knowledge, which is really great to study, but it's a trap, just like the Bible. It's a trap to someone who's looking for answers. Because when someone comes and they're thirsty for a spiritual approach, and they want to learn what's the right way to do it, you know. It's kind of like being born and looking at your mother and saying, "So, what am I supposed to do now?" You know, you don't do that. And your mother's not going to give you a book and say, "Well, this is what you have to do." You know, you have to do it yourself. Just like Anne Hutchinson said, that is the supreme authority in our church. The divine that is in every person. And that's why we have absolute freedom of conscience and of belief. So there are people who are members of this church who probably believe in a literal death and resurrection of Christ. There are lots that don't. There are many people who feel that it's evoking a very important spiritual principle, but it's something that happens all the time. Death and resurrection is something that happens all around you. Look, it's springtime. A few months ago, if we'd been sitting here, there wouldn't have been a leaf on the trees. So, coming back to the New England approach, Henry Thoreau would have gone out to Walden, for example, and looked and stared at the trees for a while, and he would have come to the same conclusion. So that's the fun part, when you start seeing the connections between completely different things, completely different people in entirely different cultural contexts. It doesn't matter what culture you're coming out of, the principles are very much the same. So, and that goes for every single part of the Gnostic tradition. We have sacraments, like I said in the homily, that mark our lives, but those are the things that also bind us together. We celebrate community, and we celebrate the presence of the divine through the Eucharist. It is one of the central mysteries of the Church, the Eucharist. It is also pre-Christian. So you don't have to be a Christian to have the Eucharist. In fact, Melchizedek, who was the great high priest, king of the Jews, you can look it up in the Old Testament, he, even though other people got in trouble for not having the right kind of sacrifice, Melchizedek was very much favored by God when he brought bread and wine. This is the first time that you see the Eucharist appear in the Bible.
Can you spell this name?
I'll give it to you afterwards. It's a long name. We know for a fact that this is not the only pre-Christian Eucharist. There are examples from Greece as well, in the ancient rites, that secret rites sometimes that were done. So the bread and the wine, it's very obvious that in the portion of the Gospel of John that was used by the regular Christians, you can see that the community, whoever wrote that, because it was usually more than one person, but they were writing, well, they're writing to kind of one-up someone else. Because, it was very common knowledge at that time. Remember that most of the people who were involved in the New Testament speak Greek. Even though it's the Roman Empire, the lingua franca at the time was Greek in the Eastern Mediterranean. So it's very common knowledge to people who knew anything about religion that Dionysus, the god of wine, he was very, very popular. Bacchus in Latin. He was a very popular god. He's also a dying and rising god, by the way. He dies and comes back to life. Ah, sound familiar? And then, of course, he's the god of wine. So how do you one-up the god of wine? Well, my God makes water into wine at the wedding, Cana. So you can hear that one, right? It's like, see, take that. We've got Jesus over here. Not only makes wine, he makes water into wine. So take that, Bacchus. So yeah, I mean, you see that these people are sharing, and it would have been perfectly normal for people in that time to share information and to believe in multiple deities, or multiple, at least in multiple faces or avatars of a conception of the divine. So you see, John the Baptist is often going along with the cult of Serapis, which was a later version of the Egyptian religion. Yeah, the Trinitarian ideal. So you'll see a lot of places that were special to the John the Baptist group. You'll see that there was a temple to Serapis there. So it was perfectly normal. It's only after the 5th century. Well, no, it's not true. Probably. It begins with very early Christianity. They're fighting with each other all the time. There is no orthodoxy. They are fighting all the time. And some of the Christian followers are, I'll say it right here, barbarians. They are absolutely horrific people who didn't get it. I mean, there wasn't a Bible to read, so I can only blame their teachers, but they were just totally bereft of anything that anyone would call Christian. And that goes straight down the line. It doesn't start with the scandals in Christianity in the 21st century or in the 20th century, or even the murder of the Cathars, or the burning of the Jews, or whatever other transgression that has been done in the name of Christianity. It's been around for as long as people have been around. It's the same goes for the way the Puritans treated Anne Hutchinson and her friends. Here are people who were suffering under the boot of the Church of England and the state, saying that they had to conform to the Church of England, which was admittedly freer than the Roman Catholic Church had been. And what do when they get their wish? They turn around and start abusing people that don't agree with them. It's a typical literalist Christian way of doing business. And you can see it especially right now on television. The kind of hateful language, racism, sexism, homophobia, violence. Just, it's not, the gospel, is an old English word. Gospel means God's spell, basically, the spell of God. But in Greek, evangelios means the good news. And these people don't give the good news. They spew vitriol. And it's absolutely the same problem over and over and over again. If anything that you believe stands between you and another person, and the other person's ability to live a dignified life, there's something wrong with your religion. There's something wrong with your religion. Anything that hardens your heart, or closes your mind, or closes your door. If a poor person comes up to you and tries to talk to you, do you turn away? That's not what we're supposed to do. That's a human being. We're supposed to have as much respect for him or her as we have for ourselves, because we're together in this. What the old scholastics used to call the ship of fools. That's what we're in. All of us are in it, including the Pope and Pat Robertson and the rest of them. And I don't say that in a way that divides me. You'll notice I'm not dividing myself from Pat Robertson or from the Pope. I'm saying I'm in the same ship of fools with them. I expect them to treat me with the same respect that I treat them. Because if I don't, we'll never get anywhere. That's what I see coming from the mystics of the Commonwealth. That's the beautiful part about New England. It's a difficult place to live. It's cold and inhospitable, especially for those people. Can you imagine living in 0 degrees with no heat, only sitting by a fire? I mean, New Englanders had to learn how to stick together and cut out the nonsense. That's why we're probably not the most talkative people in the world on the street. We got stuff to do. We're not being nasty, it's just we've got things to do. We've got, firewood to chop. You don't go out of your way, to hug and kiss people, but you do take care of them. You do take care of them. And you see that growing in the spirit. So it's something that it flows from the spirituality, from the direct apprehension of the divine. And the projection of that, or the recognition of that, in the faces of other people in the community. And you see it enliven itself. It becomes kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. It starts this snowball that leads people from the 17th century through the 18th and 19th centuries to become leaders in progress, not only in spiritual stuff, in real science, in education, in civil rights, all kinds of things. I mean, had it not been for, I'd venture to say that had it not been for the Unitarians in New England, the abolitionist movement wouldn't have existed. There wouldn't have been a single one outside. The money that was being poured into the Underground Railroad, if you look at the names of the people who were involved, almost to the name, they were involved. And they didn't stop there either. I'm not saying that you have to believe a certain political belief. What I'm saying is that you have to, what you normally react, or how you react to realizing your relationship with other people, comes out of you naturally. It flows from you outside. Your religion isn't going up here and saying, help me. It's coming from in here and going, how can I help you? That's the spirit of New England. How can I help you? And sometimes they screw up, but at least it was well-meaning. If you look at the kind of institutions that we've had, where sometimes the first of special kinds of prisons, which were different from the old prisons, which tried to reform people and to educate them instead of just punishing them, that's from here. To the Fernald School, for example. This is a school for children who were mentally retarded. Now, of course, big scandal because they were involved in eugenics back when eugenics was cool. But you learn through experimentation. Unfortunately, people make mistakes. But you can see that the intention is that it was correct. Instead of leaving these children out in the community to be boarded up in an attic somewhere, which is exactly what people used to do, they said, no, let's bring them together. Let's study this phenomenon. Let's understand it. Let's take the bull by the horns. That's the spirit that I'm talking about. That's what you see. That's the Anne Hutchinson spirit. You don't care about what the people in the General Court in Boston are saying. Don't even bother. Just do your thing, you know. Don't complain about how we don't have this or we don't have that. Nothing got built here like that. Everything was built out of a sense of community. We have to get along in this bad weather, in the ship of fools. And the best way to do it is to be proactive and say, this is how we do things. The best way that I can worship God is to make sure that other people, the people in my community, are treated with respect. That is religion in motion. If you don't believe me, ask the Apostle James. You can read that in the Bible. But you don't have to take it literally. So that's the spirit that I really wanted to kind of pull out of this series. I think that it's timely because people complain like these days. It's an election year, and I've heard a lot of things on both sides which are absolutely ridiculous. And I just look around and I look at every single institution that's worth anything in Massachusetts and other parts of New England, and I say, you know, people had some priorities straight. We have home care, for example, for the elderly now. There are a lot of states that don't have home care. I mean, yeah, it saves us money, but it also maintains their dignity. They have a reason to live. They can stay in their communities. They can live in their environment. I mean, that's just one example that I work with on a day-to-day basis. Well, it took someone to go to the general court and say, hey, older people and younger people with disabilities should be able to live a life in dignity, not locked up in some horrible jail or, school, quote unquote, out in the middle of nowhere, which in the 19th century was a good thing. But today we know how to deal with people better. So it's not, I think the problem is that we're raised to think in a linear fashion. That, well, was Jesus, what was the nature of Jesus? Was he all divine or half divine and half human? Or, I mean, they argued about this and had wars about this. It's like, who cares? You've just killed someone. You don't get it. Go to jail, do not collect $200. You don't get it, start over again. Sunday School 101. So it's a cyclical thing, and sometimes things are done with the best intentions. And at that time, it might have been a really good improvement, like I was talking about the Fernald School for retarded children. I mean, that was, I mean, far from the days of being developmentally challenged and all the new ideas that we have about special ed and all that. But it was a lot better than, being locked in a closet or in the attic, or worse, being, put into the sideshow with the, the Ringling Brothers. I mean, that's what they did with people who were different, And the way some children act nowadays, I think they probably started selling off to the circus, but that's just my opinion. So, really, we have that history here, and sometimes I think it's easy to forget how much of that originated in the ideals that Hutchinson and other mystical types held very closely to them. So I really don't know how, especially a woman in those days, had the gall really to go up and yell at. I mean, she was hauled before the general board and asked, they really went after her and berated her in public, and she wasn't a patsy because her father was, I believe he was a deacon in the Church of England church back in Cambridge in England before they came over. And so obviously she was well educated. And her husband was also educated. So, part of it is her stature. Society probably bought her some time, but pretty amazing story nonetheless. And I think she deserves a lot more attention and credit. But in the final analysis, you see that the spirituality, this kind of spirituality, is catchy, and soon the theocracy of the Puritans just is shattered, and you see the development of the New England that we have today, which is tolerant, very tolerant. It's probably the most tolerant place in the United States. But beyond the tolerance is what we were talking about today. Is that it wasn't just a matter of New Englanders being tolerant of other people's religions. It's also taking it a step further, and that's love. So that's basically the idea. I'm going to open it up for questions.